The morning my husband stood in our living room and told his mother, his father, his two brothers, and his sister-in-law that he had built everything we owned from nothing, I was in the kitchen doorway holding a cup of coffee, listening to every word. He did not know I could hear him. He also did not know that the house he was describing, the mortgage, the deed, the equity we had built over 7 years, none of it had his name on it. Not one word, not one signature. I had qualified a loan, signed a loan, made every payment alone, from an account he had never once asked to see, because he had never once thought to. I set my coffee down on the counter. I did not walk into that living room and correct him. I did not raise my voice or clear my throat or give him any signal at all that I had heard a single word. I just stood in the kitchen, looked at the wall, and made a decision that had been sitting in the back of my mind for longer than I was ready to admit. My name is Diana Mercer. I am 34 years old. I am a licensed occupational therapist working for a rehabilitation center in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the house my husband just described to his entire family as his greatest achievement. I bought it at 27, before I ever met him, with a down payment I had been saving since I was 23 years old. Marcus and I met at a friend's birthday dinner in the spring, 7 years ago. He was charming in the way that fills a room, loud laugh, easy confidence, the kind of man who remembers everyone's drink order and makes you feel like the most important person at the table. We dated for 8 months before he moved in. We got married 2 years after that, in a small ceremony, at a venue outside the city. 60 people, dinner and dancing, everything exactly the way I had imagined it. What I had not imagined was how quickly the version of Marcus I married would begin to fade, once the life I had already built became the life he lived inside. He worked in sales for a medical device company. The income was decent but inconsistent. Big commission months followed by stretches where he was pulling in almost nothing. In the beginning, I told myself it evened out. I paid the mortgage. He covered groceries and utilities when he could. When he could not, I covered those too. I told myself this was what partnership looked like during the lean seasons. I told myself the lean seasons would end. They did not end. They just became the arrangement. By year 3, Marcus had settled into the house the way someone settles into a hotel they have decided not to check out of. He knew where everything was. He invited people over without asking. He told his family on 3 separate occasions that he was thinking about renovating the kitchen, as though the kitchen were his to renovate. His mother once called me to ask what his plans were for the backyard. I remember standing in the parking lot of the rehab center after a 9-hour shift, listening to her talk about what her son was envisioning, and something very small and very cold settled in my chest. I did not correct her either. That was the pattern I had built without realizing it. I kept the peace. I absorbed the assumption. I told myself it was not worth the argument, that he did not mean anything by it, that marriages required a kind of flexibility I was still learning to practice. What I did not tell myself, because I was not ready to hear it yet, was that I had spent 3 years allowing a man to take credit for a life he had contributed almost nothing to building. The morning his family came to visit, his parents driving up from Columbia, his brothers and sister-in-law following behind them, Marcus had been on his best behavior for a week. He cleaned the guest bathroom without being asked. He made a grocery run and actually put things away. He grilled on Saturday afternoon and accepted compliments about the house with a wave of his hand that said it was nothing, really, just something he had put together over the years. I watched it all from the edges of the weekend. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I refilled drinks and brought out extra chairs and said almost nothing that mattered. And then Sunday morning, while I was in the kitchen and he was in the living room with his family before they drove home, I heard him say it. He was talking about the neighborhood, about how he had chosen it deliberately, about how he had known when he bought this place that it was going to appreciate, about the equity they were sitting on now, and how he had planned for that from the beginning. His mother said she was proud of him. His father clapped him on the shoulder. I poured my coffee down the drain because I no longer wanted it. That afternoon, after his family left and Marcus was watching football in the living room, I sat at the desk in the small office off our bedroom and opened the folder I kept in the bottom drawer, the one with the original closing documents from 2017. The mortgage statement in my name. The deed registered with Mecklenburg County, bearing my name and only my name. 7 years of payment history from an account Marcus had never been added to because in the early days of our relationship I had simply never gotten around to it, and then later I had quietly decided not to. I had seen an attorney 4 months earlier, not because I had made a final decision, but because I wanted to understand what my options were. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she had sat across from me in a calm office off South Boulevard and explained exactly what sole ownership of a property meant in the context of a marriage where no joint financial accounts existed and no commingling of assets had occurred. She told me that because the house had been purchased before the marriage, was titled solely in my name, and had been maintained exclusively through my separate funds, it was considered separate property under North Carolina law. She said, "In plain terms, the house is yours. It was yours before him, and it is yours now." I had driven home that afternoon and made dinner and said nothing, but I had started sleeping differently after that appointment, more completely, like a window had been opened in a room that had been sealed for a long time. The conversation with Marcus happened on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after his family's visit. I had chosen Wednesday deliberately, not a Friday, when the weight of it could ruin a weekend, not a Monday, when everything already felt hard. Wednesday felt like the middle of something. A good place to cut. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table and told him I wanted to talk about the house. He looked up from his phone with the mild attention of someone who expected a conversation about a leaky faucet. I told him I had been to see an attorney. I told him I had been thinking about our situation carefully for several months. I told him that the house was titled solely in my name, that it had been purchased with my money before we met, that no joint ownership had ever been established, and that I had decided I would be asking him to move out. He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than I expected. Then he said I was being dramatic. Then he said I could not do that. Then he said his name should be on that house by now, and that any court would see it that way. I slid a copy of Patricia Okafor's written summary across the table. He did not pick it up. He pushed back his chair and stood up and told me he was going to call his own attorney. I told him that was absolutely his right. He called his mother instead. I could hear the conversation from the kitchen while I washed the dinner dishes. His voice was low, but not low enough. He was telling her I was throwing him out of his own home. His mother's voice, distant and urgent through the phone, was asking him what he meant. He did not have a clean answer for that. His attorney, when he eventually found one, sent a letter arguing that Marcus had made contributions to the household that entitled him to an equitable interest in the property. Patricia responded with 7 years of mortgage statements from my sole account, the original purchase documents, and a detailed accounting showing that Marcus's financial contributions to the household had been limited to approximately 40% of the utility bills during years 2 through 5, and nothing after that. The letter back from his attorney's office was noticeably shorter than the first one. Marcus moved out on a Saturday in October, 6 weeks after our kitchen table conversation. He took his clothes, his television, his golf clubs, and a coffee maker he had bought the previous Christmas. He stood in the doorway of the living room for a moment before he left, looking at the room the way someone looks at a place they are trying to memorize. He said, "I built a life here," I said. "I know you believed that." He left. I closed the door. That evening I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine and listened to the neighborhood settle into night. The oak tree in the backyard that I had planted as a sapling the first spring I owned the house was taller than the fence now. The garden beds along the back wall were overgrown and needed attention. The porch boards had 2 that were soft and needed replacing. I made a list. I had always been good at lists. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. There was no property division because there was no jointly owned property to divide. Marcus received nothing from the house because there was nothing of his in it to receive. The settlement was straightforward in the way that things are straightforward when the paperwork has always been honest, even when the people involved were not. His mother called me once, about 2 weeks after everything was finalized. She said she had not known the house was mine. She said Marcus had always talked about it, as though it were something he had created. She said she did not know what to believe anymore. I told her I was sorry she had been misled. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she appreciated me saying that. We have not spoken since. I am still in the house on Arbor Glen Drive. The soft porch boards are fixed. The garden beds are cleared. The oak tree keeps growing in the backyard, unhurried and unbothered, the way things grow when nobody is arguing about who planted them. I have thought a lot about the years I spent absorbing assumptions that were never mine to absorb, about how many times I could have said something and chose instead to keep the peace. There is no clean explanation for that, not one that lets me off the hook entirely. I stayed quiet because it was easier, and easier has a cost that you do not always see until you are standing at the bottom of a very long bill. What I know now is that a name on a document is not the same as a life you deserve. Marcus had the name of the neighborhood, the confidence of the kitchen, the language of ownership without any of the weight that ownership actually costs. And when the weight was finally accounted for, there was only one name that had ever been carrying it. Mine. That is not a tragedy. That is just the truth, finally where I could see it. My closest friend, a woman named Sandra who had worked alongside me at the rehab center for 5 years, took me to dinner the Friday after Marcus left. She had watched the last 2 years of my marriage from a careful distance, the way a good friend does when they know the truth but also know you have to arrive there yourself. She did not say I told you so. She ordered a bottle of wine and asked me what I wanted to do next. I told her I wanted to fix the back porch, clear the garden, and sleep through the night without listening for someone else's mood. She said that sounded like an excellent plan. I started therapy that November, not because I was falling apart, but because I had spent 7 years making myself smaller in small ways, and I wanted to understand how that had happened so it could not happen the same way again. My therapist helped me see the pattern not as a failure of intelligence, but as a failure of attention. I had been paying attention to the wrong things, to keeping the peace, to not making someone uncomfortable, and not enough attention to what was quietly being taken while I managed everyone else's comfort. By spring, I had repainted the front door a deep green I had wanted for 3 years, and never chosen because Marcus preferred the original gray. I joined a weekly dinner rotation with 3 women from my neighborhood that I had never made time for during the marriage. I started running in the mornings again, which I had stopped doing somewhere around year 4 without ever consciously deciding to stop. I do not tell this story to make Marcus into a monster. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been handed a life he did not build, and had slowly, without ever making a deliberate choice about it, come to believe it was his. That is not cruelty. That is what happens when no one ever hands you an accurate mirror. But the house is mine. It was always mine. The deed says so. The mortgage says so. 7 years of payment history from a single account says so. I keep the original closing documents in the same bottom drawer. I do not need to look at them anymore, but I like knowing they are there, not as proof of anything I still need to prove, but as a record of the version of me who showed up at a closing table at 27 years old, alone, and signed her name. She knew what she was doing, even when no one was watching, especially then.